So sometime before 1846, someplace close to this pond, Walden Pond, this man, Henry David Thoreau, wrote this: "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." So 1971 is a great year for two reasons at least. Number one, my wife was born in 1971. But number two, this state gave to the nation an idea. The idea was the idea of helping our environment by creating the incentives for people to care and collect their bottles. Bottle bill was passed in 1971 here in Oregon, then in 1972 in Vermont, and then in Maine and Michigan in 1976, and then in Iowa and Connecticut in 1978, and then Massachusetts, New York, Delaware in 1982, California in 1986, and Hawaii in 2002. But it's Connecticut I want to focus on for a second. Because ever since Connecticut passed this bill, there have been people in Connecticut trying to push beyond the original bottles that the bill regulated. But since 1978, the state has been stuck because the bottle manufacturers had drawn a line that said it would not extend to plastic. Year after year, the legislature tried to extend this measure, and year after year, it failed. But then in 2005, Connecticut adopted not quite an Oregon idea, but a Portland idea. The idea was voluntary public financing for the elections of state legislators and the governor, AKA, as you call it here, voter-owned elections. And in 2008, in the first year of this program, 75% of the candidates, 78% of the incumbents opted into this system of voter-owned elections. And then in 2009, one of the first bills considered was a bill to extend the bottle bill to plastic bottles and collect about $25 million in unclaimed funds that were being held by the bottle manufacturers, which alone paid for the voter-owned election system for that cycle. The same bill that had been defeated again and again over the past 15 years in 2009 was considered and passed in 2009. One of the supporters of that bill, legislator Chris Caruso, after the bill was passed, wrote, "Watching lobbyists be ignored on the bottle bill proved that getting the special interest money out of campaigns got special interest influence out of bills." Another legislator had a much more tweetable response. He said, "Wow, voting on the merits." Right. Now it's that idea I want you to think about here. How often can we say that what we're witnessing in our government is voting on the merits? Or even forget voting on the merits. What about voting for what the people actually want? How often can we recognize that in what our government does? For example, think about this issue. This is a 14-year-old boy. He's a picture of an epidemic sweeping the United States, childhood obesity. Since 1980, we've seen a tripling of the number of children who are obese. 1/3 of kids over the age of 2 are technically obese. Now, this epidemic, of course, has costs. One of the most troubling is the rise in type 2 diabetes, the kind of diabetes that used to afflict only old people. Now 1/2 of all new cases come from kids. Healthcare costs are $147 billion annually, which leads many people to puzzle, why have we seen this radical change? Well, when I was a kid, I was fat. I was convinced it was genetic. But it's a little bit hard to imagine a whole generation becoming overweight unless we've had some weird genetic mutation. Instead, it's not genetics here, it's what we eat. There's a consensus among people who know something about the matter that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. And not technically sugar. It's actually the rise of high fructose corn syrup. 40% of the products in your supermarket, or probably not your supermarket, but the standard supermarket, has high fructose corn syrup. Why is that rise so pronounced? Well, one reason is the difference in costs between high fructose corn syrup and sugar. Sugar is relatively expensive compared to high fructose corn syrup, leading some people to say, well, that's just the market. It's what the market demands, and what can we do when the market says something is more expensive than something else will be? But of course, it's not quite so simple. Sugar is expensive in America because we protect domestic sugar manufacturers with tariffs. Another channel of our policy says we're for free trade, except when sugar manufacturers are at stake. Then we protect them through tariffs. Those tariffs give the sugar manufacturers about $1 billion in extra profit every year. It costs the efficiency of the U.S. markets about $3 billion because sugar costs 2 to 3 times the price in the United States that it costs elsewhere in the world. And corn is so cheap because it's subsidized in the United States. $74 billion in subsidies over the last 15 years, leading some economists to say it's actually a negative cost to produce corn when you include the total subsidies that you receive. And so when you add these two together, the cost of sugar, the cost of corn, we see a radical shift in the costs of food. So between the period 1997 and 2003, the cost of vegetables went up by 17%. Cost of a Big Mac went down by 5.4%. Cost of a bottle of Coke went down by 35%. And then we see a radical shift in how food gets made. I'm sure many of you saw this extraordinary film, Food, Inc., which describes how because corn is so cheap, it's profitable to raise cattle on factory farms. Not so profitable for the cattle, of course, because cattle don't actually digest corn properly, so their stomachs don't do corn. We therefore have to feed them tons of antibiotics to deal with the disease which this form of feeding gives them, which of course then breeds plentiful new forms of E. coli, some of which we can't actually address through our own antibiotics. And of course, if this were a film, we'd now cut to a scene where a 4-year-old boy eats a hamburger and dies from the infection which he then gets. All this because corn is so cheap and sugar is so dear. Now, some people look at this and they say, why is there such anti-free market silliness in this free market country here? The political scientists can say, well, we can't say with certainty why the silliness is here, but this is what we know. There's an extraordinary amount of campaign cash inside this system. As the Post described during the 2004 election, 2 sugar companies gave a total of almost $1 million to election coffers. As you know from Sunday morning television, ADM spends millions of dollars pushing the idea of cheap corn into our system. And if it's because of these campaign contributions, then we say campaign money distorts markets, which distorts food production, which distorts our kids, which at least makes it hard to believe that there was voting on the merits in these public policy decisions. Or think about the recent debacle on Wall Street. Of course, we saw in 2008 the collapse of our economy thrown over the cliff by a collapse on Wall Street. Why is it we came to this bubble and disaster? Well, as Johnson and Quack describe in this book, 13 Bankers, in part it's this perverse mix of deregulation and re-regulation that the government brought into the financial services sector over the past 20 years. Deregulation, because in the 1990s, we saw a whole host of financial innovations in new ways to spread or share or, it turned out, multiply risk. But because of this deregulation, these innovations were invisible to the market. The assets which they represented were not recorded or public or subject to anti-fraud requirements, producing this invisible shadow economy. So whereas in 1980, as my colleague Frank Partnoy described, 98% of the assets in our financial system We're subject to basic requirements of transparency and publicness and anti-fraud regulations. By 2008, 90% was invisible to these public requirements and only 10% subject to these basic standards of publicity and anti-fraud requirements. And this shadow banking encouraged the bubble, which of course burst in 2008 because of this deregulation. But that wasn't enough for Wall Street, the deregulation. They also needed a little bit of re-regulation, as Johnson and Quack describe. Signals by the government that the government would guarantee that when this bubble burst, if in fact it ever burst, they would get a bailout to assure they wouldn't pay the price. And of course, they got it, producing the dumbest instance of socialism ever in the history of man, socializing the risk while privatizing the benefit, a kind of heads they win, tails we lose structure. Insanely stupid way to regulate a financial system. Why did we regulate it like that? Well, political scientists say, none can say with certainty, but here's what we know. The largest growth, the fastest growth in campaign contributions over the last 15 years has been in these sectors, making it, again, extremely hard to believe that it was voting on the merits that led Congress to these decisions. Or think about this disaster, the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Many people look at this and they say, how is it possible that we could have such a profound experiment in deep water drilling without extensive environmental impact and risk studies? After all, where I come from, we've just gone through 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental studies to build this clean energy alternative to deep water drilling. So what did they actually have to do in order to get the permission to build this site? The answer was 17 pages of environmental impact statements before they were exempted from any more. Now, of course, when Congress heard about this, they were shocked. Yet, of course, it was Congress that had required this insane structure of regulation or lack of regulation through approvals within 30 days of applications. And you might ask again, why? The political scientists say, we don't know for certainty, but here's what we do know, endless campaign cash, making it impossible to believe it was voting on the merits. Or one final example, Barack Obama's health care regulation. Some people thought Barack was going to Washington to change the way Washington worked. And some people were led to believe after the passage of the health care bill that in fact he had changed the way Washington worked. My friend Ezra Klein, who I agree with 98% of the time, wrote this amazing piece after Barack passed that bill, saying the Obama administration succeeded at neutralizing every single industry. Well, that's not quite what happened, as Glenn Greenwald puts it. If by neutralizing, Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefits, then he is absolutely right. But the way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it had to be done that way, but one cannot reasonably deny that it was. Evoking the words of the 20th century's greatest philosopher, David Byrne, same as it ever was. Again, making it impossible to believe we had voting here on the merits. Now, in all these cases, we don't even dream anymore about the idea of having a system that would vote on the merits. In all these cases, our good souls around us accept this is the system we've got. Good souls hacking at the branches of evil, none who is striking at the roots. The roots. So, do we have root here? Do we have a sense of exactly what's behind this craziness? Its picture looks something like that, but it's not the money that inspires a Rob Blagojevich. It's not the money in brown paper bags that's being handed out to congressmen secretly. Our Congress is, I think, among the cleanest Congresses in this sense in the history of our Congress. Instead, the money here is the money described in this extraordinary book by Bob Kaiser, So Damn Much Money, flowing through an economy of influence, at the core of which is lobbyists who feed members, who feed special interests, who feed the lobbyists. The system of dependency where the special interests indirectly through the lobbyists control members, producing this marionette Congress, a system of dependence upon the lobbyist fundraisers. Now, don't get me wrong here. Dependence can be okay. I've got a couple very young children. I want them to be dependent upon me. Indeed, the right dependence is okay. And you can even understand independence as a function of the right kind of dependence, right? We want an independent judiciary. That doesn't mean a judiciary that does whatever the hell it wants. It means a judiciary that is dependent upon the law, that uses the law to guide it, and only the law to guide it in the decisions that it makes. And the framers of our Constitution, giving us a republic, intended that to be a representative democracy, by which they meant a system where the branch of the federal government ought to be dependent upon the people alone. There was a dependency at the core of this system of dependence upon the people alone. But in the current system we have evolved, where members spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money for them or their party to get back to power, where they develop this sixth sense about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money, where they live the life of shape-shifters, constantly bending themselves to conform to the impression or image they believe their potential funders want. This is Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, who describes when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, always lean to the green. And then she clarified, he was not an environmentalist who told her to do that. This system does not produce a system where Congress is dependent upon the people. It produces a system where Congress is dependent upon the funders. And here's the obvious point. The funders are not the people. The system we have evolved is a corruption of the system our framers gave us. Not a corruption of congressmen or congresswomen, a corruption of Congress itself. Now again, the political scientists will tell us, we're actually not sure of that. They'll say, actually, we tried to do the numbers and there's no correlation between roll call votes and money contributed. Which kind of reminds me, somebody said there was sexual abuse going on in the Catholic Church and you put a drone above the Catholic Church and watched and said, oh, geez, we don't see any sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, so there isn't any sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. That would be the equivalent of this kind of reasoning. Because as a Boston politician, Martin Lemosky, puts it, Washington's the sort of city where one never writes if one can call, never calls if one can speak, never speaks if one can nod, and never nods if one can wink, which reveals the deep system of relationships that permits the complex dances that members and lobbyists do to facilitate the economy of influence that is Washington. And then the perpetually optimistic say, well, maybe the funders are the people. Maybe it's the same group. So what if it's the funders they are dependent upon? That's just to be dependent upon the people. But here's what we know. The people who fund are not the people. 80% of people who make less than $75,000 a year never give to political campaigns. And 80% of people who make $75,000 a year or more do give to political campaigns, meaning there's a huge gap between those who give and those who don't. Now, the optimists say, well, maybe those members just ignore the funders in general and just follow the people. They just take the money from the funders and do what the people want. Well, even that, we have data to contradict. Martin Guylan's from Princeton, an extraordinary analysis of the relationship between attitudes in different income groups and what Congress actually does, concluded, but I also find that when Americans with different income levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflect the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of poor or middle-income Americans. The vast discrepancy, as he puts it, cannot be ignored. 10% of the American public supporting an idea will get it passed in Congress if they are the rich. 90% opposing an idea will not stop it from getting passed if they are the middle class and poor. I think these facts together lead us to conclude that this much we know. Congress is dependent upon the funders. Congress follows the funders. And therefore, this Congress has been corrupted by this dependency which is inconsistent with the dependency our framers intended. Now, even if you're still not sure, there is no doubt about at least this. About this you can be absolutely sure. People believe that money buys results in Congress. Overwhelmingly, people believe that money buys results in Congress. Whether or not it is true, this is what people believe, and that belief has an effect. As Rock the Vote calculated or produced in a poll they just conducted last month, the number one reason why young people will not vote, outdoing the second reason by a factor of 2 to 1, is, as the poll put it, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. That belief leads them not to vote, and it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans will not vote in this election because of this perception. The vast majority of the reasonable people in the middle will not vote in this election, leaving the election to be decided by the crazies, you and I, from each extreme in this political debate. Now, some people then say, well, you're just talking about perceptions. How can we decide a political system on the basis of mere perceptions? But there is no mere to this story. This perception, whether true or not, weakens our democracy. And what more would you want for a justification for a reason to respond to that perception? So what could we do? Well, in my view, the only way to strike at this root is to cut the connection between these funders and our government. And the only way to do that is to embrace the idea of a Republican. It's hard sometimes, I know, but to embrace the idea of a Republican 102 years ago to support citizen-funded elections, or as you call it here, voter-owned elections. In Congress, this is the idea behind a bill that has passed the House Administration Committee and I think will pass the House this year, the Fair Elections Now Act, which would limit voluntarily contributions to any member to $100 matched 4 to 1 by the government, so that a congressperson could come to office never having received more than $100 from any citizen. And in Portland, of course, the idea is the idea behind the voter-owned election system, which you have had now and which you need to consider to continue. With both of these systems, we fund elections by small contributions only, meaning politicians will focus on the people and not on large funders. So what would that system do? Well, in Congress, it solves the problem, it mitigates the problem. The funders are closer to the people. And that changes politicians because they don't spend their time raising money on the telephone from the richest. They spend their time face-to-face raising small dollar contributions in a way that is much more responsive to the people. And it changes the kind of people willing to be politicians. Imagine deciding whether you'd become a politician if you knew that 2 to 4 hours every single day you would be on the telephone calling random people, well, not so random, but people from around the country you'd never met, asking them for money. I doubt there are many of us who would voluntarily accept such a job, yet there are some, they just are different from us, those sorts. And it would produce a different Congress, a Congress that wasn't constantly contorting itself out of fear that it might anger the most wealthy and powerful within our society. Indeed, the biggest measure of this is an issue which I'm not sure even many people recognize. If I asked you, what was the average income of the top 10 hedge fund managers last year? The average income, what would you say? $10 million? 519 million? So take the 519 million, add it to $1 billion, and add another billion, and then you get $2.5 billion. That's what it was, the average income. Now, what was the tax rate they paid? 15%. Capital gains tax rate. They paid less on that $2.5 billion than their secretaries paid who worked for them. Now, when Barack Obama came to office, he said, this is an outrageous loophole and it existed since the 1960s. We have to close it. Took the idea of closing it to the Senate, controlled by the Democrats. The Senate said, are you nuts? We're not going to get these guys angry at us over something like this. And the idea was blocked because a Congress didn't even have the strength to stand up to make the same tax rates for the richest in our society, because the system of funding these elections made that decision impossible. And then, thirdly, it changes the possibility for trust. It makes trust here possible. So that when Congress does some stupid thing, at least we could believe, as we all want to believe, that it might have been because there are too many Democrats or because there are too many Republicans, but it was not because of the money, the condition necessary to produce trust inside the system. And in this city, when at least the participation in this system improves, increases to a percentage that it becomes the dominant way this campaign gets run, it keeps the focus of members of the city government on the voter and not on the funders. And this is important because the jurisdiction of city government is huge, from issues around the Columbia River crossing to the tram, to the waterfront, to the streetcars, to Oswego, right? These are all extremely important and rich issues, all demonstrating a high BDP. What's that, you ask? Okay. High boondoggle potential, BDP. And high BDP equals a high potential for corruption. And again, not the corruption of bribes, but the corruption of the wrong influence produced by the wrong dependency produced in a system where members are dependent on large contributions to get back into office. It is a significant fact that 98% of the money supporting the opposition comes from these funder wannabes from a business organization in this city that is leading the way, I suggest, backwards. Portland, we as a campaign need you to get this issue right. We need you, we, the U.S., need you to get this issue right. We need you to take this image and, in an important sense, invert it, producing voter-owned elections that lead the way for the nation forward. Now, one more before I stop. I'm wearing these funny shoes. These are Keds. They're kind of cool, but I wear these funny shoes because they're made by a company called Stride Right. Stride Right was started by this man, Arnold Hyatt, who was a hero in this debate. So Arnie's a little bit humble. This is the biggest picture I could find on the internet of Arnold. It's not really visible. But Arnold is a loyal Democrat who in 1996 was the second largest contributor to the Democratic Party. So in 1997, President Bill Clinton invited him and 30 other large contributors to a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. Fat cats around a table telling the president what the president should do. And each of them was invited to address the president, and around the room the tables went and stood up and told the president what they thought, and Arnold was the last to speak. We don't actually have a picture of him speaking. I kind of envision it sort of like this, but he stands up to address the president, and he says, "Mr. President, I know that you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, so I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1939, when he recognized he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy." But because he said, "Mr. President, you too must convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. A war against fascists, a war against fat cats, people like us. People who believe that merely because we are wealthy, we have the right to direct how government policy develops. People who believe that we are entitled to pick up the phone and call the president or a senator. People who believe that somehow they should have more power inside a democracy than the people." As you can imagine, in this room filled with fat cats and the president, when he finished, there was a little bit of silence. The only recorded account that we have of the event describes Clinton's response in the following way. Clinton's response effectively slashed Hyatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Now, 14 years later, I think it's time for we, the people, Democrats and Republicans alike, to recognize that it was Arnold Hyatt who was right and President Clinton who was wrong. That we do need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. But Arnold's mistake was to believe that it would be politicians who would wage this war for us. When's the last time politicians themselves went to war? It's not the politicians, it's us. It's citizens. It's citizens who will push to get this institution to change itself. This institution, which under the last poll conducted by Gallup earns an 11% confidence rating from the American public. And 11%, who are those crazies out there? 11%. There were more people who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than believe in our Congress today. Now, we need to look at this number and respond in the way our framers intended, with a movement, a citizens' movement that starts in the States, that starts in this city to strike at the root to this problem. Don't stop now. Portland, you need to teach and commit us to this reform. When Ben Franklin walked out of the convention that gave us the Constitution, a woman stopped him on the street and said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you done?" And Franklin said, "We have given you a republic if you can keep it." A republic. A representative democracy. A system dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic. It is not the government we live under today. Join us. Lead us to get it back. Thank you very much.